A very good evening and welcome to another edition of Newsline. Of course, tonight's show is a recorded show. Getting to know our guest this evening, it's none other than Daniel Alphonsus. He is a former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. A very good evening, Daniel, and welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Daniel, we've been speaking a lot about the economy, not only on Newsline, but on many of our other programs as well. Something that has really come to the limelight in these discussions on Sri Lanka's recovery and Sri Lanka's economic crisis is this new central bank bill that has been presented in Parliament. Of course, the matter was taken to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court gave a determination that none of the clauses in the central bank bill are inconsistent with the Constitution. However, whether or not this bill would aid Sri Lanka in moving into the future and coming out of this economic crisis does not have any or too much of relevance with its compatibility with the Constitution. There are many people who speak in favor of the central bank bill, true. However, there are those who find giving the central bank complete independence a little bit problematic, as Parliament is the body that exercises control over public finances. What's your take on this new bill?
So let's look at the context and divide into two questions. The first is, what were the framers of the series of central bank bills trying to achieve? And then secondly, the question of, do these bills actually achieve that objective? So let's start with the historical context. The historical context is that Sri Lanka has faced macroeconomic instability, like the macroeconomic instability that we experienced the past year, which is one of the most severe cases, primarily as a result of the government's expenditure exceeding the government's revenue. And the way in which that's been enabled is by the central bank, quote unquote, printing money. That is generating rupees for the treasury when the treasury has a financing requirement, which arises when expenditure is greater than revenue. What the central bank bill tries to do is it tries to limit this in two ways. First is it requires the central bank to not print money, but it can help affect the price at which the treasury borrows money by purchases on the so-called secondary market. That is, once people have bought treasury bills and bonds from the treasury, it can then go and buy some of those. But it can't directly give money to the treasury to finance its day-to-day requirements. So that was the other main way in which it sought to limit that is by shaping interest rates in order to keep inflation at a limited amount. We've seen the horrendous effects of inflation, the cost of living increases that have taken place the last year and a bit. And what it seeks to do is to try and depoliticize the interest rate setting process to some degree. It's not like the European Central Bank or the Federal Reserve, where it's an entirely apolitical process set by technocrats. Here, the process that has been designed is a more dialogue between the central bank and central bank's monetary policy. They have different names for it: group or board or committee, and the treasury. So that's the sort of overarching objective.
But Daniel, at the end of the day, who gets the final say in these matters? Is it the government? Is it the governor of the central bank? Who reigns supreme?
That's a very good question. So the Supreme Court, in its ultimate judgment on the matter, said that the direction and control of the Republic is vested with the Cabinet of Ministers. Therefore, in the event of a disagreement between the central bank's monetary policy committee and the Treasury or the Minister of Finance, Cabinet will decide. So in other words, interest rate policy will be determined by a political body that is Cabinet. And it'll be determined by politicians, not by independent persons.
But Daniel, now isn't this counterproductive? Isn't this the same thing that we're trying to move away from? I'm just trying to grasp what changes does the central bank act really bring to Sri Lanka and in its recovery process? Because now initially you said the point was to depoliticize the setting of the interest rate. But if the interest rate is now finally set by cabinet again, how is that a depoliticization of the procedure in setting the interest rate?
So let's start with the 2019 November bill that was passed by cabinet. That attempted to create this process where the central bank and the treasury would set an inflation targeting framework together, basically set the framework for setting interest rates together. There was no dispute resolution mechanism in that particular bill, but it also had a provision to limit the central bank printing money. That is the primary placement of government securities with the central bank, where the treasury can go and just ask for money. That they limited. Then this was these two measures were watered down in the cabinet presented, the cabinet approved bill earlier this year. And then the central bank, the Supreme Court has further watered it down with the point I just made, that cabinet ultimately decides on the inflation targeting framework, and thereby the framework within interest rates are set. Furthermore, the limitation on the financing of the treasury directly by the central bank has also been slightly caveated by this language like liquidity in exceptional circumstances. So this also waters it down a little bit. So what we see is a continuous watering down from the intentions that were set out through a long period of deliberation that culminated in the November 2019 cabinet approved bill that's been slowly watered down. And it's still an improvement on the status quo, but does it reflect the depths of the problems we face, and does it meet those challenges? I don't think so. Does it mark a substantive change? Probably not. Does it reflect the opportunity that exists in the country today as a result of the crisis and the hue and cry for substantive reform and change? I don't think so either.
But Daniel, why do you say that it doesn't create any substantial change? Because for the longest time, I think we had the worst case scenario during the previous government under former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, when he outright appointed a politician in the form of a former governor of the central bank, Ajit Niwad Cabral, as the governor of the central bank, and that entire process was politicized. So do you think issues like that are really addressed in this bill?
So it helps. It has a greater system of checks and balances and accountability. So that's just why I said it is progress. It's certainly progress. There's no doubt about that. And the extent to which it is progress will be determined by practice. The extent to which cabinet will actually exercise these decisions, the extent to which the wording I mentioned about liquidity in exceptional circumstances is interpreted and used by the courts, by the officials, by the political actors, that is going to determine the extent to which the bill is a success in meeting its objectives. Not everything can be purely legislated for. But it could have been a lot stronger in terms of the law itself. I think it falls significantly short of what Sri Lanka needs and the expectations that of those who are calling for reform.
Daniel, we've been talking about reforms. Finally, we have something on pen and paper in the form of the IMF agreement, the piece of paper or the agreement that was drafted both between the government and the IMF and then received IMF board approval. There are those who say that the conditions that have been imposed on Sri Lanka through this IMF agreement are too harsh. And there are even political parties in the opposition that vow to change some of these conditions when they come into power. Speaking on the longevity, at least, of this IMF agreement, we've seen there were 16 programs before. They were not long-lived. As soon as Sri Lanka got back on the horse to a certain degree, they dumped the IMF and moved forward with whatever policies they felt fit. Do you think that an opposition party, given a day they come into power in the near future, of course, would be able to change these conditions like they claim?
I don't think it would be very easy to change the broad structure and form of the program for two reasons. The first is the space to negotiate is relatively limited for the government of Sri Lanka. We are really at rock bottom and have very little space to say we're not going to do what's needed for the next review. It'll put us back into a situation similar to what we experienced, and obviously no responsible government would do that. Secondly, the structure of the IMF programs is such as you have these milestones, you have 6 reviews. In each of those reviews, there's always a bit of space for course correction and so on and so forth, but it'll be within the framework of the broad targets that have been established. So it's kind of, if you take one apple out, you have to, a red apple out, you'll have to put a green apple in. It'll still have to be something quite substantive.
Daniel, do you think that these conditions are too harsh for Sri Lanka, or Sri Lanka might not be able to meet these conditions? I know the IMF agreement itself says that there are risks in the program not working out, given Sri Lanka's political situation and also Sri Lanka's past interactions with the IMF. What's your take on this?
Yeah, so I think it's a significant missed opportunity in my view. If you look at the broad structure of the program, it's actually not hugely dissimilar to the program that was there between 2016 and 2019, 2020. And for me, that shows the extent to which it's a missed opportunity. The depth of Sri Lanka's need and crisis is greater. The change in public opinion is substantive, and it really doesn't show the ambition that is required to put Sri Lanka on a road to prosperity. Even if you look at the program, it's projecting a 3% growth rate throughout the program period and beyond, actually. So in other words, it's a program that isn't designed to be particularly ambitious, and I feel that that is a huge missed opportunity, that we could have put in place the necessary reforms to put us from a 3% growth trajectory to a 5% plus growth trajectory if we had put in things that were a little bit more ambitious.
But Daniel, haven't we always done things, overestimated ourselves and done things really ambitious? For example, like the Hambantota Airport, or huge economic zones surrounding the airport, the Hambantota development projects, the ports. Don't you think it's better to be cautious now that we've hit rock bottom and, well, take it slow? Don't you think that's a better option, Daniel?
So I think the fact is that it's a different type of ambition. It's an ambition to put through tough reforms, building ports in the middle of nowhere, airports in the middle of nowhere with debt that you take on with very little accountability. That is not difficult reform. That is not ambition. So what is ambition is, and what is an exercise of leadership, is pushing through things that are difficult, that are not easy, that are complex, in order to transform our growth trajectory. In that sense, I think the program lacks the ambition it could have had. Then in terms of your question about, since we've had this record of not completing programs, of not doing things, does it make more sense to be more circumspect in our ambitions? There again, I'd say, unless you try and reach for something greater and something more ambitious, even if you fall short, you'll still get something. And that's what we saw in 1977. We saw Sri Lanka really seriously say, we are going to go from third world to first. We are going to become like Singapore, and put in place a significant number of measures that took us at least some of the way there. If you look at Sri Lanka's growth trajectory, it's kind of flat until 1977. It's only after 1977 that you see growth pick up and the economy transform. So in other words, it was an extremely ambitious program. It fell short, but it was still a substantive improvement over the status quo. And I think this could have been that opportunity, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's quite going to be that.
Well, there are people who would agree with you. And of course, there are those who might say that, the program that's there is a little bit more realistic. However, We will continue this discussion after a short commercial break. On the other side, we'll discuss how global factors, the de-dollarization and other factors will affect Sri Lanka in moving forward. Stay tuned. You're watching Newsline on TV1.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Cardinal expresses dismay over delayed justice for victims of the 2019 April attacks and calls to form a human chain on the 21st of April. Manayaka Theoros warned of the dangers posed by the proposed anti-terrorism bill. Sumandiran questions delay in presenting the IMF documents to Parliament. Sri Lanka at 75 is a failed state, says former President Chandrika Bandaranaike. Sri Lanka gets more time to pay back Bangladesh loan. Search continues to locate inmates who fled from the Taldena Prison Rehabilitation Centre in Badulla.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there and welcome back. You're watching Newsline. We're in discussion with Daniel Alphonsus. He is a former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. Daniel, we were speaking about the current situation in Sri Lanka as far as the IMF agreement goes. However, there are also external factors that will affect Sri Lanka's progress towards the future. Sri Lanka's coming out of this crisis. And one of those factors that's been spoken of a lot, actually, in the international arena is the de-dollarization, especially with Saudi Arabia agreeing to sell oil to China and receive payments in yuans. Sri Lanka also has taken a similar move, not in terms of oil, but in terms of trade with India. We've agreed to make payments and settle payments in Indian rupees. This process of de-dollarization that is being seen across the world, how do you think this will affect the situation in Sri Lanka?
2 points. First is I think one should be careful about overstating the extent of de-dollarization. The dollar's share in global trade has remained steady for a very long time. And the ability of the renminbi to be used in global transactions is always going to be limited by the fact that China does not have an open capital account and doesn't make it fully convertible. In the case of India as well, it can only apply to goods which we would want to import from India. There will be a limit to the extent of to which we can Indian rupeify our trade, because other suppliers in other countries will not accept Indian rupees. And even from what I understand, Indian companies are also sometimes not especially keen to receive their payments in Indian rupees as opposed to US dollars, because they in turn need to pay their suppliers and so on in US dollars. So it's not something that is going to happen fast. And even slowly, I think one should be cautious in the extent to which one states the case for de-dollarization. That said, I also think it's of very limited significance to Sri Lanka's current problems. Our problems are problems of the fact that we don't raise enough revenue in taxation. We have a monetary policy that is often quite counterproductive to our developmental goals. We have short-sighted decision-making. We have the politicization and use of public assets and policy for private interests. And these are really like, we are a sovereign country. And in that sense, we are sovereign and have made our own choices that have led to where we are. So I think external factors have been secondary in our predicament.
Daniel, you said we're a sovereign country, and the choices that we've made for the past 75 years has led to where we are right now. One of these factors that influence the choices a lot of our politicians make is corruption. And this aspect has even been included in the IMF agreement, where they have required the Sri Lankan government to bring in several legislation to deal with corruption. Recently, an anti-corruption bill was also published in the Gazette. It's due to be tabled in Parliament, and that procedure is to be continued. However, on the aspect of corruption, how far do you think the IMF will be supervising Sri Lanka at least on ensuring transparency in Sri Lanka's path out of this crisis?
So I think there's two cornerstones for the IMF's engagement with Sri Lanka on corruption. One is the corruption bill you referred to, which helps implement Sri Lanka's commitments under the UN Convention on Anti-Corruption. And that bill is a very progressive bill. It introduces many useful features that will help limit the level of corruption. So I think that's a very substantive step forward. The second cornerstone of their engagement is a corruption diagnostic that they're preparing, basically looking through the governance structure of the country and identifying areas for improvement in terms of corruption. Now, I think obviously this will be helpful, but I'm not sure it'll really address some of the core problems that Sri Lanka faces in terms of its economy, at least, because in my view, a substantive share of the issues that have arisen over the past 75 years and the last couple of years as well have arisen just as much, at least, as a result of bad policy making. And that bad policy making isn't necessarily driven always by the pursuit of pure private interests. It's also a lack of effort and diligence in studying the problem. It's also, in some cases, poor ideology. And in some cases, it just seems to be plain old stupidity. So to give you an example, if you take the Mattala airport, it's nearly $200 million, built in the middle of nowhere, with a bird sanctuary in the middle. We all know it's an utter white elephant. That is not a decision that was necessarily driven by corruption per se, because that money could have been easily used on another project which had a much higher economic return. Let's say the electrification of a suburban railway line, and it could have experienced equal levels of corruption, but nonetheless, the economic returns for that investment are very, very different. So I'd be cautious to think that just by introducing anti-corruption measures alone, we can solve some of our economic difficulties. Another example would be, for example, the fact that we've kept on printing money for such a long period of time, knowing full well that it's going to lead to inflation and the sovereign debt crisis that we experienced, instead of raising taxes. So that's not corruption per se. That I think drove that decision. It's just bad policy making.
But Daniel, at the time, the central bank governor at the time was of the opinion that money printing doesn't really affect the rise in inflation. He cited the United States as an example and said they print so much of money, they don't have that bad a case of inflation.
So that's proving my point that stupidity is at least as responsible as corruption for this crisis.
Daniel, one final question, since we've got just a limited amount of time left. Daniel, Sri Lankans, we moved into the new year. The Sinhala and Tamil New Year is just done. Of course, during this new year, how people celebrated it is a different matter entirely. There were a lot of shops were quite full, but then there were traders complaining that they didn't have as much business as they do in the previous years. However, there's this argument being propounded that, Sri Lankans are not as bad financially or aren't faring as bad financially as people make it out to be, because a lot of the clothing stores were jam-packed. There were several malls and shops in Sri Lanka that were quite full during the festive season. As an economist, how would you respond to a person who brings up this argument and says, oh no, Sri Lanka is not as bad as people make it seem?
So first, I think the numbers are fairly clear. There's been a drastic decline in consumer expenditure. We see that from the very large negative growth numbers, what I think is nearly minus 10% last year. Now, as to why anecdotally you may still see people in shops, the way people consume may have changed. They may have put all their consumption in the festive period and not consumed as much before. ticket sizes of the things they purchased may have been smaller. Also, this could reflect different groups in society. Some groups may be more affected by the crisis than others. So it's really quite complex as to how and why that translates into the drastic fall in consumption I mentioned. But I don't think just from an example like that, one can draw any serious conclusions.
Thank you very much, Daniel Alphonsus, for joining us on our program and, well, giving these details to the general public. Of course, we would like to have you again because this economic crisis seems to be continuing or to be continued for many years to come. Thank you very much for taking time off your busy schedule and joining us on Newsline today. Thank you very much to also all our viewers for tuning in. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.